Focus on Headline. And let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in the studio, we have our reporters, Yoo Soo-min and Park Se-won. Guys, welcome back.
Good evening, Asray.
All right, we're going to continue to talk about that two-day NATO summit, right? It's been in the headlines for quite a time, all throughout this week. President Yoon Suk-yeol, the first South Korean leader to take part in the NATO summit. A lot of attention on him as he was one of the speakers there. As you know, all the world leaders kind of talking about the security and economic issue. Of course, with him, there are certain security issue topic that he has raised when he was the seventh speaker to take the podium. So start us off, Soo-min, what was his message all about?
Yeah, so he primarily called for cooperation and support from the Western Alliance Group and Asia-Pacific partners, obviously, on North Korean issues in particular. So he taking the stage for about 3 minutes. This was the pillar of the message. He said that the international community must show that its will for denuclearization is, quote-unquote, stronger than that of North Korea to develop nuclear and missile programs. He then called North Korea's missile and nuclear programs, quote-unquote, outright violation of UN Security Council resolutions and also a serious security challenge on the stage. Well, in the meantime, he addressed some other security challenges as well, expressing hope for close cooperation with NATO on economic security and cyberspace. The president also touched upon the group, the NATO's new strategic concept, adding that multi-layered security challenges nowadays cannot be dealt with by a single regional alliance. And he also added that the concept of security is now being expanded to include the realm of economic security, obviously including the supply chain issue. Well, then he did talk about the concerns that kind of constantly floated the potential backlash from China over South Korea's attendance at the summit. So when he was asked about that, he said, rather than naming a particular country, NATO allies and countries in the Indo-Pacific should work together in solidarity to create a cooperation that respects a norms-based order, one that respects freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. So again, repeatedly emphasizing his original stance. And then citing South Korea and NATO have made headway in security cooperation in areas like politics and military since establishing a global partnership back in 2006. He added that South Korea will play an even bigger role in their partnership.
Yeah, again, South Korea's participation at the NATO summit, the big concern was whether or not this was going to sour ties between Seoul and Beijing. And so far, what we've been seeing, and I keep mentioning it, the Balance Act, right? And so far, I think President Yoon, again, not mentioning names like China, and specifically naming China, I think he's done enough to not really necessarily target China. I know China has been a little bit upset that South Korea is taking part in the NATO summit, but no harm, no foul so far. What is the president's major focus in bilateral meetings with some of these major countries? And also, let's talk about some of the expected results as well. Se-won, walk us through on President Yoon's schedule during this the two-day NATO summit.
Sure. President Yoon does have a hectic schedule in South Korea's debut at the Global Military Alliance. On the sidelines of the NATO summit, he will be holding bilateral meetings with leaders of major countries, where he will be promoting the country's export, which is the country's major economic driver. So one of the key words at the president's first NATO summit is sales diplomacy, and that is because the economic growth in China, South Korea's biggest trade partner, is slowing down, so there's a need to diversify and find alternative markets. And Europe is the next biggest market in the world after the United States. Europe's GDP is around 17 trillion US dollars, similar to China's. Europe is also Korea's third largest trading partner. Specifically, President Yoon is looking for deals to export nuclear power plants as part of his pledge to make the country a nuclear reactor superpower. In his meeting with Polish President Andrzej Duda, Yoon emphasized Seoul's advanced nuclear technology proven through the Baccarat project in the United Arab Emirates. The South Korean government also announced that it will go all out to win deals to nuclear power plants in the countries that are about to choose contractors, including Poland and the Czech Republic. Also, South Korea's industry minister Lee Chang-yong met on Tuesday with his Czech counterpart Joseph Sikela. During that meeting, 10 contracts were signed on nuclear energy and hydrogen power between companies from two countries, including the auto giant Hyundai Motors. And one expert on nuclear power says projects in Poland and the Czech Republic could bring in billions of dollars to the South Korean economy. And he added that Netherlands and the UK also suggested cooperating with South Korea in building nuclear power plants in their countries. Another main export the president is focusing on is arms sales, for which demand is rising amid the war in Ukraine. The presidential office says weapons exports to Poland will likely be the first fruits of President Yoon's sales diplomacy, as the two leaders have discussed this matter intensively. Now, South Korea is already among the world's top 10 arms exporters, but a defense industry expert says that weapons exports to NATO members will help South Korea gain a competitive edge in the industry. A defense expert said if those planned exports lead to positive results, some expect the South Korean defense market to have the second largest share in the global market after the United States. So with the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, South Korea is looking to strengthen supply chains in advanced industries, including semiconductors and batteries.
Yeah, I thought this was an incredible thing for South Korea. I mean, you're looking at a number of countries that certainly need a bunch of things, and kind of South Korea digging in there and going, we could provide you with this, we could provide you with that. And this term sales diplomacy is something I think that's kind of exclusively used here in South Korea. But you saw...
Sales diplomacy.
Yeah, it sounds weird, right? Sales diplomacy, like what does that mean, right? But yeah, they went and about and talked about, nuclear power plants being built. There's certainly going to be a lot of semiconductors, battery fields, military equipment, and so forth. But just a very quick correction there. Lee Chang-yang is his name, the industry minister. Lee Chang-yong is, of course, the BOK governor. Similar names. Gets quite confusing at times. But, we know that South Korea wasn't going into the NATO summit to kind of irk China. I mean, I know the United States, they mentioned kind of China here, although Russia was kind of the main focus even at the G7 summit and at the NATO summit as well. But still, though, the fact that you had 4 Asia-Pacific countries taking part at the NATO summit as an observer nation, again, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, China is going to express some kind of discomfort regarding this very summit that was happening over in Madrid, especially this new strategic concept that would be potentially name a country as a challenge. And we're talking about China here. So Sumi, tell us more about this.
Yeah, so obviously Beijing is uneasy. They are not happy about the military alliance summit happening in Madrid. Now, just like you said, SJ, it's the first time the NATO has invited the 4 heads of government from the Asia-Pacific region, namely South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. And also, it's the first time that the China challenge, the quote-unquote challenge, is expected to feature in NATO's strategic concept, and the very possibility of labeling China as a quote-unquote systematic challenge in the new strategic vision immediately irked China and some other state media outlets with much harsher rhetoric. So for one, China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian saying that China pursues an independent foreign policy of peace, calling the bloc a quote-unquote product of the Cold War. So NATO's so-called new strategic concept is only an old wine in a new bottle, according to the Chinese spokesperson, and that it still has not changed the Cold War mentality of creating imaginary enemies, apparently, this time referring to China and also the bloc confrontation. He then pointed out that some NATO members have been sending aircraft and some warships to waters around China in recent years, elevating tensions because last year, Britain and France have sent warships to East China Sea to conduct joint exercises with the United States and Japan and also let them pass the Taiwan Strait. The spokesperson also added that we solemnly urge NATO to immediately stop spreading false and provocative statements against China, adding that NATO should stop seeking to disrupt Asia and the whole world after it has disrupted Europe. Well, the Chinese government apparently used some diplomatic rhetorics, not directly pinpointing South Korea and Japan's attendance at the NATO summit, but the state media outlets like the Global Times blatantly blasted the 2 Asian nations' participation. So in a word, the editorial said, bringing NATO into the Asia-Pacific region is like bringing a wolf into the house, and then downright denounced South Korea and Japan's attendance at the NATO summit by saying that it would inevitably cost them as it damages strategic mutual trust between South Korea and China, and of course Japan and China, putting South Korea and Japan in a quite difficult spot in trying to navigate a wiser and strategic relationship with China.
But it was kind of interesting. I think I saw the Global Times article in regards to this because they said, Yeah, South Korea, we're not happy with what South Korea did in participating with the NATO summit and some of the things that you guys have been doing, kind of, increasing this alliance with the United States. But, South Korea, you're not as bad as Japan. That's kind of the way that they put it. It's like Japan's kind of like pushed it up there. South Korea, we're not happy, but I mean, it's not as bad. But even with this, right, China they're very careful with what kind of words they use against South Korea as well. Because, I mean, we saw them send the vice president to President Yoon Suk-yeol's inauguration. They know that even right now, China, they need South Korea. South Korea is not a country where they just go, you know what, we don't need them. No. But at the same time, South Korea still needs China as well. So it does seem like at this time, both sides are trying to go, all right, listen, I mean, we got to watch out for what we say. We still need to have this good relations. And so far, so good. But I mean, these, state-run medias, they're just still going to express some, I guess, uneasiness and some disappointment towards the participation of some of these Asia-Pacific countries. But at the same time, China bringing up their distress on the international stage at the UN Security Council briefing. So, Sumin, tell us about this.
Sure. So at a Security Council briefing on the war in Ukraine, Ambassador Zhang Jun first expressed concerns about the protracted and extended nature of the conflict and then dedicated 1/3 of his time to the North Atlantic Alliance, the NATO. Zhang said that Beijing was deeply concerned by the bloc's strategic adjustment under which the alliance seeks to train its sights on the critical issue of dealing with China going forward. He urged the NATO to learn its lessons and not to use the Ukraine crisis as an excuse to stoke worldwide bloc confrontation or to provoke a new Cold War. And then he, quite similarly with the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, demanded not to look for imaginary enemies in the Asia-Pacific region as it apparently refers to China or contrived disputes or divisions.
Yeah, again, it really is right now the Western allies versus China and Russia. Again, although, G7 summit was mainly focused on Russia, and I think even with the NATO summit, China kind of indirectly being mentioned, but Russia was kind of the big thing at this time. Speaking of which, I mean, we are seeing this continuous aggression from Russia. In fact, it's actually getting worse and worse when the G7 member nations and the leaders kind of announced these number of sanctions on Russia. Russia kind of responded with devastating attacks in apartment blocks, kindergartens, shopping centers that killed innocent civilians. But now it's not only Russia being the main focus of NATO, but China mentioned for the first time as a challenge in NATO's strategic concept document. We talked about this just earlier in this segment. Sehwan, tell us about the stance of NATO leaders on Russia and China.
Yeah, the NATO leaders released a statement right after the Russian attack on a shopping center in the Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk. Also, on the first day of the NATO summit in Madrid, alliance leaders sent a strong message to Russia, calling the country a direct threat. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, "It makes clear that Russia poses the most significant and direct threat to our security." While condemning Moscow's cruelty in Ukraine, the leaders also vowed to provide long-term support for Ukraine. So NATO's statement came as part of its new strategic concept, which was unveiled Wednesday. It was actually the first time a NATO strategic document specified the challenges posed by China toward NATO's security, interests, and values. The NATO chief said that we are seeing a deepening strategic partnership between Moscow and Beijing, and China's growing assertiveness and its coercive policies have consequences for the security of NATO allies and partners, adding that Beijing is not an adversary but a serious challenge. It's noteworthy that previous strategic document had directed harsh language against Russia, but not against China, so it is officially the first time China was mentioned. Nevertheless, the official turn by NATO comes as the U.S. is increasing its guard against Beijing. Meanwhile, during the summit, U.S. President Joe Biden announced that Washington is bolstering its military presence in Europe to respond to what he called a changed security environment. This, he said, includes establishing establishing a permanent presence in Poland. The alliance leaders also welcomed the invitation for Sweden and Finland to join the NATO, hailing it an historic event.
Yeah, the fact is, right, if Russia did not invade Ukraine as they did back in February, this NATO summit was probably going to mainly focus on China. Russia was probably not going to be mentioned whatsoever if there was absolutely no invasion. I mean, it's just that the agenda has been shifted from, Russia being the top of the agenda and then China second, which is why, China is still going to be mentioned because initially, before the invasion, China was the number one agenda for these NATO nations, especially because, again, it's a U.S.-led coalition here. But still, Putin not very happy about NATO's move to accept the two Scandinavian countries in their alliance after Turkey lifted their objections against Finland and Sweden, right? So let's talk about what his reactions were like, so on.
Yeah, so Vladimir Putin has issued fresh warnings that Russia would respond in kind if NATO set up military infrastructure in Finland and Sweden after they joined the U.S.-led alliance. So Putin was quoted as saying he could not rule out the tensions would emerge in Moscow's relations with Helsinki and Stockholm over their joining NATO. He said they don't have problems with Sweden and Finland like they do with Ukraine, since they don't have territorial differences. So he said it's up to them if Finland and Sweden wish to join. However, he warned if military contingents and military infrastructure were deployed there, he would be obliged to respond symmetrically and raise the same threats for those territories where threats have arisen for us. So Russia has repeatedly warned Finland and Sweden against joining NATO, saying the serious military and political consequences of such a move would oblige it to restore military balance by strengthening its defenses in the Baltic Sea region, including by deploying nuclear weapons. Russian officials earlier reacted angrily to NATO's offer of membership to Finland and Sweden, calling it a destabilizing effort that will increase tensions in the region. The accession of the two countries into NATO would mean the end of a decades-long status quo that saw Finland, in particular, maintain a degree of neutrality during the Cold War in order to avoid a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. I have a great deal of doubt as to whether the upcoming period will be calm for our North European neighbors, he added. As Sumin mentioned, Putin and Russia had provided an opportunity to create an imaginary adversary for NATO and the United States to unite with its allies, since Iran is not enough cause for them to be united. He said the military intervention in Ukraine will continue since the goal of the Ukrainian war has not changed, which is to free the eastern region of Ukraine and ensure Russia's security, and there's not need to set a final deadline for its operation. He also denied the accountability for bombing in Kremenchuk, saying the Russian force never attacks any civilian facilities.
Come on now. Really, from the very start of the Ukraine war, there's been constant attacks on civilian, areas. And when you're telling me, they could easily say, we were aiming for a military facility, but we missed. Instead, we hit a kindergarten. We were kind of aiming for this, but we hit a shopping center. We can't believe it. And what's interesting is, again, I think what Vladimir Putin was looking at was when Ukraine, again, it kind of stemmed from Ukraine wanting to join NATO, right, along with Georgia. Putin very unhappy with this. He wanted those countries as a buffer state, and so this war happened. And then he was hoping that countries were going to be scared off and say, oh my goodness, this is what happens when you try to sign up for NATO. Instead, what happens, two more countries want to sign up for NATO. So it's not working too well for him right now, but it's scary when you're saying Putin is going, yeah, we do not have a deadline for when we're going to be ending this war. And that's actually pretty scary, to be honest with you. Guys, also on the occasion of the NATO summit, the three countries, South Korea, U.S., Japan, reiterating their commitment to enhance cooperation to address North Korea's ballistic missile program as well as their nuclear weapons program as well. It does seem like the trilateral summit did go as well as planned, right, Sumin?
You're right. So, just like SJ has consistently mentioned, restoring our relationship with Tokyo, with Japan, of course, is one of President Yoon Suk-yeol's top diplomatic agendas. And looking at the words officials used, we could get a sense what the trilateral summit was like. And the presidential official actually told the reporters after the trilateral summit that, quote unquote, security cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Japan has been restored as of today, adding that the White House also described it as, quote unquote, historic and very successful. So onset at the trilateral summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol said that trilateral cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Japan has become ever more important in the face of North Korea's growing nuclear threat, which, he said, are becoming more sophisticated than ever. Now, we do know that President Joe Biden bids to improve the quite frosty ties between the two major U.S. allies, South Korea and Japan. And according to a White House readout that was released on the gathering, Biden said, "Our trilateral cooperation is essential to achieving our shared objective, including a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and also a free and open Indo-Pacific." He also added that the defense capabilities of the Japan, U.S., ROK, Republic of Korea alliances need to be upgraded as part of the essential effort to strengthen the trilateral partnership between Japan, the United States, and Republic of Korea. And that this trilateral summit is being organized at a timely juncture. And throughout this meeting, he said he hopes the trilateral cooperation regarding our response to North Korea will be solidified. Well, apparently Washington again reaffirmed its resolve to encourage trilateral cooperation amidst North Korea's growing nuclear threats and also growing security and economic challenges from China. Well, the previous day on Tuesday local time, President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida spoke for a few minutes for the first time at the dinner hosted by the King Philip of Spain, a quite rare conversation between the two countries because they have not had a former bilateral summit since 2019. But Seoul's top office quite cautiously predict that a recovery in bilateral relations with Tokyo could be possible because they have witnessed the shared desires in Madrid to improve relations between the two countries.
Yeah, but I mean, again, when the United States is involved, there is a certain kind of topic of issue that they're going to discuss. And there are certain things they're not going to discuss when the United States is involved, which is why these trilateral summits between the three countries, it's easy to come about.
Yeah.
Right, but the hard one is having the leaders of South Korea and Japan sit down for talks because the main topic of discussion is going to be number one first. I mean, what created the tensions between the two sides, the historical issues, right? Disputes. But still, there is some good signs, right? It's multiple encounters, but guys, it was very short encounters, like hellos and stuff like that. But a lot of people are saying that with this, right, and especially with all the trilateral summit going pretty well, people are saying that there might be a Seoul-Tokyo Seoul-Tokyo summit coming up in the near future. But obviously that didn't happen. But what is the possibility of this? I mean, what's the hope of actually having a summit between the leaders of the two countries?
Yeah, well, the experts say not all hope is lost. Experts say that the fact the South Korean leader himself expressed his will to improve relations is something that Japan can think of positively. And when the political situation allows, conditions for deeper conversations will be created. One of the political situations, for instance, could be Japan's upper house election next month. In fact, experts are convinced that the very first Yoon-Kishida summit is highly likely to take place afterwards. Also, a two-track approach that isolates historical disputes and highlights common interests and solidarity based on economic security may be a more appropriate way to mend ties between the two countries. For example, flights between Seoul's Gimpo and Tokyo's Haneda airports resumed on Wednesday, and the decision came as part of President Yoon Suk-yeol's efforts to improve South Korea and Japan ties and bolster exchanges between the two countries. The Gimpo-Haneda line was being closed for 2 years due to the pandemic, and resuming the airline operation is expected to boost more exchanges between the two countries. So not only they share economic interests, but also because the two governments share similar diplomatic interests in China, North Korea issues and alliances, beefing up cooperation between South Korea, U.S., and Japan, and participating in the IPEF. So more active involvement will broaden Seoul-Tokyo coordination. Plus, security ties between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo have never been tighter than they are now, amid concerns that Pyongyang is on the verge of resuming nuclear tests. Also, experts point out that trilateral cooperation on security, driven by the U.S., will allow Seoul-Tokyo ties to improve. However, there are hurdles after hurdles for the two countries' relations, namely taking care of possible South Korean court rulings resulting in the liquidation of the Japanese firm's assets in the country over Japan's wartime forced labor.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's not the first time the U.S. kind of came in between mediating and saying, I mean, listen, we would love to have three of us really cooperate nicely. I mean, it happened during the Moon administration when, I mean, tensions between Seoul and Tokyo was probably at the worst. But, I mean, this is what it is, right? I mean, Japan, whichever administration, they're not going to give up on the fact that they're not going to give up this money. They're not going to give up this asset. And then, I mean, the Yoon administration, despite the fact that they really want to improve ties, it's going to be hard for them to really overlook that, because then the South Korean public is going to go, whoa. We understand that you want to improve ties with Japan, but there are certain things that you just don't touch, right? The forced labor issues and the forced sexual slavery issue during the war era by the Japanese military. So this is probably one of the toughest things for the two sides to really kind of resolve here. But the hunt for a diplomatic solution is still expected to continue. South Korean government planning to launch a joint public-private body to address this very issue that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, one of the reasons South Korea-Japan relations are currently at a stalemate is the issue of compensation for Korean victims of forced labor during the Japanese colonial period. And the South Korean government has moved to establish a joint public-private body in order to address this issue. The South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs has decided to establish and operate a public-private cooperative body starting on July 4th, so that scholars and other experts can come together to come up with specific solutions to resolve the issue. Since the South Korean Supreme Court ruled in October 2018 that victims of forced labor during the Japanese colonial period should be compensated, the Japanese government has refused to participate in relevant discussions, arguing that the issue was resolved by the 1965 Claims Settlement Agreement and that the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling violates international law. On the news of the launch, victim support groups and civil society members pointed out that our side shouldn't be so easily swayed and obsessed over making diplomatic achievements, like having a summit when Japan hasn't demonstrated a change of attitude or taken corresponding measures, while acknowledging that making efforts to come up with a solution in whatever shape or form is a positive thing.
Yeah, again, I mean, this is, there's a lot of difficult things that the Yoon administration really needs to resolve in the next still 5 years or so, and this is probably going to be one of the most difficult thing if they really do truly want to ease tensions between South Korea and Japan. So, I mean, we'll see what happens. Still a lot of time. We'll see, even if a lot of experts are saying that what they saw so far, though, was just a brief exchange of hellos between the two leaders. There's hopes that there's going to be a Yoon Kishida summit happening in the near future. And, I mean, what they discussed then is going to be, I think, the most important thing, which is why, to be honest with you, Joe Biden coming to South Korea was big, but I really want to see this, right? I want to see what's being discussed in the future summit between Seoul and Tokyo. Let's move on to some economy-related news, something that we've been watching very carefully in the past 2 days or so. South Korea's minimum wage for next year. This was increased 5% despite inflation worries. Sumin, tell us more about this.
Sure. So representatives of South Korea's labor and management have eventually agreed to set next year's minimum hourly age at 9,620 Korean won. That's $7.41, which is up 5% from this year. So the Minimum Wage Commission, this is the rate-setting body consisting of 9 representatives, each from labor, business, and the general public, struck the agreement on Wednesday night. Well, the new rate translates to a monthly wage of 2.02 million Korean won, and it will apply equally across all different industries. Well, throughout the negotiations, the labor side called for a significant increase from this year's 9,160 Korean won, which is an 18% increase, calling on the need to carry out the previous Moon Jae-in administration's promise to raise the minimum hourly wage to 10,000 won. So suggesting the minimum hourly wage to reach 10,091, which would have been a 10% on-year increase. However, the management side had called for a 1.86% on-year increase, citing the economic damage caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, coupled with the high interest rate, raging inflation, and also the high exchange rate that we're seeing. Now, the discrepancy among the representatives apparently were really wide. The labor and business side failed to bridge the gap, and the final figure eventually was proposed by the commissioners representing public interest because they essentially hold the casting votes in this decision. Well, the proposal was passed by a vote of 12-1 with 10 abstentions, with all 9 members from the general public and 5 members from the labor present. Now, the reason why there is such high abstention votes was all 9 representatives from the business side left in protest right after the results of the vote were announced, but they were included in abstentions. So by law, the commission is required to present the new minimum wage to the labor minister, who is then required to announce it publicly by August the 5th. Well, it marks the first time in 8 years that the commission delivered a verdict on time. So the new minimum wage system will take effect on January 1st, 2023.
Man, Sumin, I appreciate the little things, the little updates on what 9,620 Korean won translates to in US dollars, because this morning it was actually at $7.39. She got the latest exchange rate on this. Now it's $7.41, which means the Korean won got a little bit stronger against the greenback during that span of 24 hours. But good. It's $7.41. I'm trying to remember. No, what the minimum wage in the United States, the federal minimum wage, I think in the United States is something like $7.50, I believe, or is it the $8? Man, it's been a long time since I've been in the U.S. But it's similar. But I mean, that's considering the fact that the greenback is so much stronger against the Korean won nowadays. But what do you guys think on next year's minimum wage system? Because the labor union, they wanted that 10,000. That's like the significant milestone, right? 10,000 Korean won per hour. It's going to be hard to get that. But I want to get your thoughts on next year's figures here. 9,620 Korean won per hour. Someone, let's start off with you.
Well, I think the management side is already not happy with the result. And I was kind of expecting the minimum wage to go over 10,000 mark as a laborer. But considering how SMEs are suffering from all the wage hikes.
Well, I'm sorry, are you getting paid minimum wage here?
No, but still, we are infected by all the minimum wage. It's based on that. So still, I was supporting the labor side for some reason. But the inflation is too high, and the increased minimum wage will affect the overall inflation next year too. So I don't think it will be changed next year.
Yeah. Sumi, what about yourself?
Yeah, obviously, just like Helen said, business side is also, not happy about the agreement because what they're saying is that it does not reflect the economic reality that we're seeing amidst this prolonged COVID-19 pandemic. That what they were saying was it's difficult for small business owners, especially, and the medium-sized enterprises to cope with a 5% increase even because we're, suffering with high inflation, high exchange rates, still reeling from the prolonged pandemic. And also, if companies cannot pay their employees, it will spill over to workers. So, and also I saw a report commissioned by the Federation of Korean Industries. They said even the 10,001 Korean won per hour, which is a more conservative scenario than what was proposed by the labor community, if it's realized, it will lead to a sharp drop in employment, drop in jobs. Up to 165,000 jobs will disappear across the nation if the, 10,000 Korean won minimum hourly wage is realized. So I do understand the labor community's position. A 5% on-year increase does not really even meet the actual inflation rate. That's what they are saying. But, we are all going through difficulties altogether. So especially until the economy gets a little better, I think we, all have to agree on this.
Yeah. I know this is a very sensitive topic, and normally I don't pick sides, and I usually tend to side with the labor side, like Sewon, right? I tend to side with them. But here's the thing. Right now, this current situation, the current economic situation, I honestly don't think it's right to raise it too much because what happens when we had the first real significant rise in the minimum wage during the Moon administration, everyone's like, all right, I mean, it's not 10,001, but it's a very good step. And a lot of labor union people were kind of, I can't say they were completely happy because they wanted 10,000. But what did that lead to? There was a lot of these mom and pop shops and a lot of these businesses, they were unable to afford these the employees. And so what happened was they started raising prices. So yes, the minimum wage price went up, but the prices of everything went up to meet the payments for these workers who are now getting paid more. And so if at the state where inflation is already super high right now, and then you start raising the minimum wage, and these stores and these shops and these businesses can't afford paying these workers the minimum wage, they're going to raise the prices of every other goods in order to meet that demand. And so at this current state, with the inflation so high, it's very, very risky to raise it too much. And so, yeah, absolutely, I think they should really wait until things are settled down a little bit with the inflation. Very quickly here, let's talk about semiconductor news here, because Samsung became the first to mass produce a 3nm chip, overcoming limitations of microprocessing. Someone wrap us up very quickly.
Sure. Samsung Electronics kicked off mass production of 3nm chips that are more powerful and efficient than predecessors, beating rival Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing TSMC, and it is a key milestone in the race to build the most advanced chips in the world. South Korea's largest company will begin with 3nm semiconductors for high performance and specialized low power computing applications before expanding to mobile processors. By applying so-called gate-all-around transistor architecture, Samsung's 3nm products reduce power consumption by up to 45% and improve performance by 23% compared to 5nm chips. Samsung's push to be the first market with the latest technology is essential in its uphill climb to match TSMC, which remains the dominant in the contract chip making or foundry market. The Taiwanese firm accounts for more than half of the global foundry business by revenue, followed by Samsung with 16.3% of the market share.
Yeah, I mean, TSMC, I mean, it's a huge chunk that they have in the semiconductor market. Guys, thank you very much for your report and your insights on some of these issues as well. Please stay safe. We'll see you guys again.
See you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.